Hi, everyone. A quick word of warning about this week's episode. Harold and Maude contains scenes of suicide and self-harm, and we're going to be talking about that. If that's something you'd rather avoid, then you probably want to skip this one. This week, Michael and I celebrated life by stealing cars, going to funerals, and watching Harold and Maude.
Welcome back to How Did You Miss This? A podcast where we celebrate life by taking time out of it to fill in the gaps in our movie watching histories. I'm Evan Toller-Hickey, and with me as always, Michael Hansen and Chris DeShane. And today we're going to be discussing the 1971 cult classic, Harold and Maude. This film is listed in the American Film Institute 100 funniest movies of all time. The Writers Guild of America ranked the screenplay number 86 on its list of 101 greatest screenplays ever written. It was called the greatest love story of our time by no less an authority than Mary from There's Something About Mary. Chris, one of your favorite movies speaks so highly of this film. How have you never seen it? How did you miss this?
Okay, so number one, not one of my favorite movies.
Is too.
Yeah, we'll go all day. I honestly didn't know this movie existed. I think that's the honest answer. It was made before I was born. It was a cult classic, and it's just not something that ever really bubbled up. And I mean, the funny thing is, having seen Something About Mary a bunch of times where they reference it, I didn't register that. Like, that is not the part of Something About Mary that you remember. There's a lot of other stuff in that movie that does stick. So it's just one of those things that I was like, I don't know what this is. There's a lot of old movies. I have no idea what they are. So I had no idea what this was until you kind of pulled it out of the hat for what we were going to watch. But Michael, I'm not the only one. You haven't seen this movie too.
Actually, another admissal listener, I have watched this before.
Oh.
I think when I was 8 years old.
Oh my!
And
no,
because in Sweden, any movie is okay when you're 8 years old.
Did you have Amadeus flashbacks watching this movie like I had?
No, the funny thing is I had no flashback because this left no impression on me whatsoever. And so I might as well have missed it because I didn't really remember anything about it.
Right.
So yeah,
it was Jacob's Ladder.
As one of these.
My Jacob's Ladder.
Right, yeah, that's right. Except with slightly fewer demons.
Evan, why is this the movie? Because this is the movie that you picked for us to watch. Why is this the movie for you?
Because I love this movie. This movie, in the same way that a broken clock is right twice a day, I agree completely with Mary in saying that I think that Harold and Maude is one of the greatest love stories of our time.
Possibly the only thing from that movie that you do agree with.
And I would like to let our listeners know that I had picked this movie before we watched There's Something About Mary, and was almost apoplectic when they brought it up in the film because I dislike that film so much. And
yeah, you did actually talk about taking it off because
I was like, do we need to take this off the list because I can't. But I think that's a good in for everyone because it's been mentioned in a movie that we've spoken about, and it's a movie that I just think this movie is so funny, and I really I love this film. It is so strange and wonderful. But I know that I am in a minority in thinking that because this is a cult classic. And when it was released in December 20th, 1971, it garnered horrible reviews. I think my favorite quote is that Variety magazine called it as much fun as a burning orphanage, which to me is hilarious. Not a burning orphanage, but just that turn of phrase, I think, is perfect for this film. It's great.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're gonna have probably a fair bit to talk about on this one, and I bet Evan is just very anxious to know what we both thought about it. But before we get there, maybe we can talk a little bit about how this movie came to be.
Yeah. So as I said, it was released December 20th, 1971. I think it ended up actually taking the slot from The Godfather, which wasn't done at the time. Am I right on that? No, I don't think so. Godfather was way later.
Something got pushed back, and they squeaked this in just for, I don't remember what movie it was, but they squeaked this in hoping to get in time for award season, which is why that late December release.
Yeah, and it had no real marketing and just completely tanked because it is a strange and divisive movie. It cost, $1.3 million to make and made a huge $10,000 in its week in theaters. So like a complete bomb. And yet, because it did make it in for award season, Bud Cort and Ruth Gordon were both nominated for Golden Globes for Best Actor and Best Actress. And, I don't know exactly why it established such a cult following, but this is maybe the original sort of like cult classic film. That one that has ended up sort of like playing in different rep theaters like all the time. Like run for a couple of years in like Minneapolis, Montreal, Detroit, Paris, the German city of Essen. It's been shown continuously since June 6, 1975, with the exception of a 10-week break due to Corona in 2020. And it's definitely gone up in esteem. As we said, like it's name dropped in Something About Mary. The AFI, puts it on their comedy list. Writers Guild. It's ranked, one of the top all-time comedies and rom-coms in a lot of lists, which is pretty impressive for a film that was written as like a master's thesis, basically, for in film writing. So it's cool that it's had that kind of arc. And even today, like Rotten Tomatoes score of 86.
Yeah, I think one of the things for me where you can see maybe how it taps into the right stuff in that era. I mean, it's directed by Hal Ashby, which if you ever even saw a picture of this guy, you're like, okay, this guy is about as hippie 1971 guy as you can get. It's got a lot of those kind of counterculture, anti-war, whatever kind of elements. So it's definitely easy to see how it can build some of that momentum after the fact. And I think, Ruth Gordon, who, had already won some had won one Academy Award, as well as some other nominations and Golden Globe wins, like, is something to see in this movie. And definitely has some name recognition in that era. So I think there's enough where you can see how it's going to hit the right tone with the right folks. But that's something I'm going to be really interested to talk about as we go, because I do think there's that big, play of counterculture and, being of a certain era for the right kind of folks at the right time. But I'm curious now that we've, seen it, Michael, as the kind of somewhat not having seen this, is this a movie that you'd recommend to people? Is this something you enjoyed?
I would not recommend it, and I did not enjoy it, but with caveats on both, because I did not remember what type of movie it is. And I think actually it is two movies in one. It starts out in a very bizarre way, and where Evan thinks it's the funniest thing he's ever seen, I don't think that's funny at all. But then towards the end, it actually becomes a different movie, and it's incredibly sweet and incredibly moving, and has huge messages about life and about how you should live it to the best. That part, if I could bottle that up and recommend that, I would recommend it to everyone. But it's very hard for me to recommend the entire movie as a whole, because it just I did not enjoy it as a whole. But there were parts that I thought, wow, this is actually really good.
If you could maybe distill it down like one of Maude's scent things and just give them the
That's right. There was a setting.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. How about you, Evan? Is this something you're still deeply in love with?
Absolutely. I think that this movie is so funny and so scathing and so wry and so touching. It really covers a lot of ground for me, and I just, I would be careful on who I recommended it to, but I think that I think that people who enjoy a black comedy, this is a black comedy with real sweetness to it. This to me is it's the double salt licorice that I love so much, that Michael sometimes brings back from Sweden for me.
I found myself watching this movie and being a little bit like, this kind of reminds me of a Wes Anderson movie. Like, it's weird, quirky characters, very weird story, unique visual style. Like, not to say it's all the way Wes Anderson, but I'm like, for me, there's echoes of something there.
I would say Tim Burton too.
Yeah, certain elements of it too. Yeah, especially some of the exactly. Certain other directors where you're like, hey, maybe if you like those, maybe then. But I'm a little bit kind of in the camp of Michael, where I didn't really find parts of it funny. And I didn't, what's the right way to put it? I think it's a very like genuine movie in a lot of ways, where they're really trying to make the point about like, enjoy life, and there's a lot of things out there to enjoy. I found we went over the same ground a little bit too much for my taste. Like, there's not a lot of like narrative and stuff driving this movie. It's more kind of about those messages and some of the humor that goes into it. So it didn't really land for me. I don't think this is something that I would recommend. But I mean, we're going to get into it. So maybe we'll take a quick break and we'll talk about why we landed where we did on this movie. And we'll be right back. Oh, hey, welcome back. So we are going to spoil everything about Harold and Maude. So brace yourselves because we are going to start doing that right now, and run away if you don't want spoilers. So what is Harold and Maude about? Well, Harold is a young man obsessed with death. His dreary existence brightens when he meets Maude, who's a free-spirited 79-year-old woman with an insatiable zest for life. Their relationship deepens as Maude teaches Harold how to enjoy life and defy society's expectations. So, I mean, Michael kind of touched on it up front. This is a movie that is a black comedy. It's got some, serious notes to put in about, living your best life and how to do that. It veers from suicide and death over to like stealing cars and stealing trees, and like it's a little bit all over the place. So I'm very curious. Like, I know, Evan, you kind of put this in black comedy, but again, this is kind of one of these movies where we're watching it and it's one of those like, this is a little bit hard to nail down for me. Is this one style of movie for you, or is it a bunch?
I mean, I feel like we can kind of take a page out of, was it Takashi Miike who said that genre labels are there for reviewers and no one else, Chris?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like it's there. Like, to me, this is a love story. It's a character piece. It is an extremely darkly funny movie. It is satirical. It can be farcical at times, and I'm here for it. I am here to embrace all of the parts of this film.
I don't agree, and I think that it is. There's one thing to say that it's all these things. We shouldn't be too obsessed with genres. There's a different thing to say. Back to what we talked about last week. It's like if you need to know who you are. And this movie, I don't think knows what it is.
Really?
And it's doing a lot of things at once. And then it actually does. It's kind of like it's got this super sweet movie in there with a beautiful message. It's just hiding. And you have to dig through a bunch of layers to find it. And this is going to really annoy you. So brace yourself.
Okay.
I think this is important in what it did, the same way that There's Something About Mary was important because it set the stage for subsequent movies later on. I don't think that this is that movie, but I think it was really important in people going, oh, wow, we can do that. We can tell stories differently. And they could improve on that concept and do something new with it. And I think that those wouldn't be successful if this hadn't done it first. I just think that this really struggles with trying to be too many things, and it's not, and it shifts, it oscillates between different genres or types.
That doesn't upset me at all, Michael. Like I think that's a totally valid.
I found myself, I made the comparison to Wes Anderson, and I found myself thinking a little bit of like, Royal Tenenbaums or something, where you have these like deeply flawed, deeply hurt people in this like truly bizarre and weird setup, kind of existence that they're in that movie. Except I'm kind of with Michael there, where it kind of like veers a little bit too off the rails in different directions at points. I found like when you've got these two, I don't want to say very graphic, but very graphic suicide like scenes within the first 10 or 15 minutes. I'm like, okay, where is this movie going? And to Michael's point, by the end, it's a very different film, though you still have these kind of like, fake suicides playing out throughout. So I was never quite sure where this movie was trying to go. And that kind of like tripped me up. But I mean, to that point, I can also understand how you can get to a movie like, Royal Tenenbaums or, something like that, where you're like, okay, I can see how you connect the dots, 30 years later or whatever to get those types of films. Right.
Yeah, and I think that you can definitely, connect the dots on where the film itself goes, because, those opening shots are so close to, very, very close shots of Harold, and they are so dark and so deliberate. And the closing shot of the movie is, a very, very, very wide shot. He's quite far away. He's walking along the cliff. It's bright. It's light. He is gone from a place of darkness and death obsession and a need for a need for acknowledgement from his mother or from anyone, need for attention, to be in his new life affirming self, playing banjo.
But that's what I mean. Like that's what I mean about what it does so well towards the end. In the beginning, you just see that he is mean to others, self-obsessed. He just does these things. Essentially, it's not about him dealing with stuff. It's about doing it to other people. And then you explain it and go, okay, I start to understand a little bit more about him. It's just that, especially when you start to look at some of the girls that get brought in, like they have nothing to do with this in terms of they have no guilt in his, yet he is putting them through some really terrible things, and we're supposed to laugh at that, but in reality he's just a jerk. But then later it all makes sense, and he explains about the one time that he got a reaction from his mother was when she believed that he was actually dead. And it's like, wow, this is really, really good. It's just, it is too much all over the place for me that, yes, at rewatch you would get that and you can enjoy it in a different way. But first it was just like, hang on, like this makes no sense. But then later, all of a sudden it does.
Yeah, I found the same kind of thing where I was like, I think the those kind of arcs that the characters go on and the things that drive those characters. Again, it's kind of one of those things that if you'd found out a little bit earlier in the movie, I think it would have made some of the things that happened. Like, especially I find I don't like Harold. That's the thing for me. I adore Maude. I don't like Harold. And I even found by the end that there hadn't been enough to redeem Harold for me. I just don't like him. So like, forget Harold, fuck Harold. I don't like him. Maude is great. So I wish it was like Maude and that other guy. Cause that's kind of what it was a little bit more, for me, because I found, kind of to Michael's point, like, that opening scene really, I think it doesn't do a bad job of setting what this movie is about, where you kind of got this whimsical Cat Stevens music playing as you have this long tracking shot following Harold, and then he hangs himself. And it's very jarring. And I found that's kind of what happened throughout the movie, where it's just like, oh my God. And not in like a fun way or in a way that made me think, it was just like, sometimes it felt like it was just too much. And like, yeah, I think Harold's a jerk. So I don't know. I found it hard to kind of buy in to him. But I think one of the things about that too, and maybe that's why it was a little bit of the challenge, was there's not much, or I felt anyway, at least, that there isn't much plot to this movie. Like, it just essentially follows Harold meeting Maude, and then the two of them kind of hanging out, getting to know each other, and the kind of evolution of their relationship. There isn't necessarily anything happening from a narrative perspective to move things along. Am I wrong?
I don't know that you're completely wrong on that. I will say, where there might not be a lot of, like plot points happening, but there is a lot of growth. And so I'm there for that. It's the sort of watching Harold begin to bloom like a daisy, and going on that sort of journey with him, that he is, going to sort of embrace life and start being someone who isn't afraid to live. To me, that is as good a narrative as any.
I 100% agree with you about it's not a problem for me, the lack of like big plot things moving it along, because that in itself, the way you said it, that's enough to have a movie, because it just kind of like the whole thing is around this obsession with death and things withering away, and people who walk around, and they're all like this whole thing around the daisies, right? Like the tragedy that everyone's unique, everyone has something different, yet people act as though they're just the same and part of something, and kind of like, that is a beautiful, beautiful point. But then you throw in this, in my mind, this idiotic thing around the uncle and the army and the military, and the thing around the tree that they want to do that might have a nice thing in there, but then chasing around with the cop on the motorcycle. It's just, there's so many things where I just go like, ugh. But the core thing of it, I don't blame them at all for having, like, maybe it's a pretty simple thing, because it's a beautiful plot, like just around like this person who was so obsessed with the one thing, and getting him to open up and think about life in a different way. Oh, that's worthy of a movie, just that little thing on its own.
Yeah, I'm there with you, because I found some of the other stuff was distracting. I found going back to the suicide gags over and over and over wore a little thin on me. And to your point, you're like, for me, there was a little bit of repetition, which I didn't love, where it's like, okay, so he has a wacky adventure with Maude. Maude instills some wisdom and insight into leading your best life. He goes and scars some other poor girl with a suicide attempt in front of his mother, and then repeat that pattern. And I think that's where it wore out a little bit on me, where I wish it had been a little bit less of the same, like, suicide thing, hijinks with Maude, and then life lesson with Maude kind of pattern that played out a few times there. I found by the end that wore a little thin with me, and that was a little bit hard to be like, okay, are we doing this again? That's where I think the lack of that kind of like narrative thing wore out on me, where I was just like, okay, I get it. We're going back. Yeah, Maude's great. She's teaching him how to live. I get it. Can we move this along, please? Because Maude's great, and the other guy was fine. But, hey. So I think one of the questions I had, after watching this movie, obviously, Maude is a big driving force in it. She's got this, zest for life. Live. Is Maude the original, manic pixie dream girl for all these movies that follow, where she's this wacky, zesty woman who is, the perfect match for this other guy and makes him truly appreciate life because she's so wonky and out there?
Yeah, I think she is. And in being the original one, still ending up subverting it by being 79 years old and not sort of a hot 22-year-old punk goth or whatever, you know what I mean?
Cameron Diaz or whatever, yeah.
Or Cameron Diaz. Is she? Yeah, I think she is. And I think that's great. I really love the depiction of a senior being that character. I think it's exciting. It's still something that we don't see a whole lot of today.
That part, I think, is bang on. Like, technically, she's not the original, because you go back a couple of years and you have Jane Fonda and Robert Redford in Barefoot in the Park. But exactly what you said around, like, here you have a senior, and she's actually not too far playing the age of the character in the movie. Because she was about 75 when she did this, and it's brilliant. Like, that in itself, that is so out there, and it's an amazing take. So many times, and very similar to like the Jane Fonda thing I mentioned, that many times I would be like, this is a person I could spend 45 minutes with, and then I would have to be like, okay, I've had enough. It's too exhausting for me. I don't love the character all the times, but I love that the character exists in the context of this movie, because it really is so unique and different. And it's like, good for you. That's brilliant.
Yeah, I love Maude. I think one of the interesting things for me is, for me a little bit anyways, in that same way that the manic pixie dream girl in a lot of, rom-coms or whatever, winds up being a little bit flawed, because you're like, okay, she's great for that guy. I think the thing that was missing for me a little bit was like, what's in it for Maude? Like, I think Maude deserves better than Harold. So that's the part I'm interested in, is the connection between the two of them, because I mean, you can see what she has to offer him. I was a little bit lost on what she was getting out of the Harold relationship. Beyond, like, I can understand it as the, like, hey, here's a soul who's maybe in a distant version of myself. Maybe I can see that. I think it's interesting, though, as it moves more into that romantic aspect of that relationship between the two of them. So I don't know. What did I miss there?
Well, I don't know that she's looking back and going, that's a distant version of myself. I mean, Maude likes to make things grow. She basically says as much. And I think in seeing Harold, she sees a seed that she wants to nurture before she dies, because she has already made her decision when she meets Harold, that before she has met Harold, that she is going to kill herself at the end of the week.
80 years and no more.
Yeah. And so to me, it is kind of that last bit of nurturing. And as things get super romantic on Harold's side, I think that Maude seems happiest when she has seen Harold grow a little bit and bloom a little bit. And that is sort of her last life affirming act, is to pass on that that sense of joie de vivre to someone else. And I think that is what she gets out of it.
Yeah, and I think actually they established that early on around her view on, people don't own things, possessions. So I think that she has this genuinely, like she can enjoy his company and the time that they have together, and it doesn't have to mean it's going to be for however long. She probably has. There's been a series of Harolds in her life at different ages and different roles, because she just genuinely seems like that sort of person who's like, not I'm going to take advantage of you, no, I'm not going to get anything out of it, but it's like we pass through this together. So that part is kind of nice, actually. I don't think that she needs to get anything more out of it than that. But then plus what you mentioned around like helping someone else see the value in growth and life and change. Like, I think that too, for sure.
In fact, thinking about what you just said, Michael, makes me wonder, in terms of there having been other Harolds in her life, if the artist that Harold finds her posing for, early in the movie, if that guy was a Harold at one point.
Is a Harold.
Or is a Harold, yeah. Or is a Harold, exactly, yeah.
It's why it's the part that made me when I hear people be like Mary being like, it's one of the most romantic movies of all times. I'm like, I don't know that I would describe this as romantic. Like, there's a lot of love and those types of things, but I don't know that I would add the word romantic to the necessarily. There's a caring, nurturing, loving, yes, but like romance, I don't think is one of those things that I would necessarily say is there. But it's an interesting thing. But I don't think we can kind of like really move on from this topic until we start actually talking about like the actual performances, especially the two lead characters in this movie. So Ruth Gordon as Maude and Bud Cort as Harold. So, obviously, I think from my upfront comments, I think Ruth Gordon in this movie is great. She is delightful.
Yeah, I agree. Ruth Gordon is great.
Good night, everybody.
I also think that, bye. There is a lot packed into her performance because she is carrying a lot of history with the character of Maude as well. There's a moment in particular that really solidifies that character for me. And it's not just a performance. It's actually a shot of the tattoo on Maude's arm, numbered tattoo. And that, like, when I was, beginning to like study film a little bit, like really kind of nailed the idea of like semiotics for me. So like the idea that like this thing points to something else. If you kind of know it, like symbolism is kind of like under the semiotics banner, it's part of it. And it's basically semiotics is kind of like if you know, sort of thing. Like, and so when you see, a concentration camp tattoo on her arm, suddenly so much of that character makes sense. And, if you know. And I think that Ruth Gordon does a fantastic job of, even if you don't know, all of that history of pain and loss still reads as an undercurrent to everything in her performance. And I think that is really, really masterful.
Yeah, I would agree, because there's definitely those moments where you just have those brief moments where it bubbles up in some way and you understand that there's, she wasn't always just some like vacuous Pollyanna who's like, life is great, but like that there's a reason that she's chosen to lead life in this way, because it wasn't always great, because she references her husband from before and it doesn't necessarily sound like the best time. And you're like, okay, there's something there. I don't need the backstory. Like, I can believe that, she's made a choice to lead life in this way, and totally understand how she's trying to get other people to head down that path as well.
But this is where I think you look at is that great acting? It becomes great acting the same way that the characters go through terrific arcs because of the changes that they do. In the beginning, she is just completely one-dimensional, and she's a weird something that you don't even understand. But then you add in these things and explain over time. Like, what is it that's okay about stealing people's cars nonstop and not thinking around it? What is it that's okay about doing all these things? Oh, it's because I've embraced life and I've had this background. It's like, it makes zero sense. And same with the Harold character around, oh, I do all these things, but then later I truly understand the motivation for it. Like, there's something there that is great, terrific acting, because you get to see the entire range of this character throughout the movie and go like, wow, that's impressive. I don't actually love her character for a fair chunk of the movie, but then later you look at it and go, okay, I really understand you. The acting is terrific. I'm not sure I love the character though. Like, there are aspects of the character where I would say, that's amazing, you picked your own thing, but you're also like, that's not amazing for the people around you in your life. Yeah. All of these who are not treated as important at all, like the Reverend, like, it just, that was my car.
And faced it and stole it. And I found those other moments too, where to your point, I struggled. Okay. Ruth Gordon and Maude are great. I found the parts where she was like straight up dumb, troubling, where it's like, oh, the police are following us. Oh, they sure love to play games. It's like, like, you just sped away from a traffic stop. Like, you're not dumb. Like, I don't know. Like, there's a few of those moments where I'm just like, really, are we doing this? Okay.
Oh, it's funny because it doesn't feel like to me like she's sort of playing dumb. It's more that she's playing up irreverence to Harold, to show him that the fragility of systems, because she has lived through the complete collapse of her own a few times. I mean, she says, like, I've died a few times, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And you can imagine that, because like, you sort of do the math, and if she's 80 and let's say this is like 1970, well, and she was, born, 1890. So she's like, which then kind of twists the noodle a little bit, because then you're like, oh, okay. So she was like, 24 with First World War happening. She would have been in her 40s for Second World War and the Holocaust. So there's all of these things where you're like, oh, wow. Okay. She has seen so much real death, so much real destruction, so much seismic changes within systems. And she's sort of made it her own job to show people that there is impermanence, in her own sort of like playful way. And so I kind of get it. And I can see why she probably wouldn't like cops. She probably wouldn't like authority.
I can get that. I think where for me, it's like just a whole series of choices where it's like, okay, and every car I drive, I'm going to drive with my foot on the floor, careening around corners and maybe rolling over this car. Like, there's that Lonely Island song about like, YOLO, where you only live once. And it's like, yeah, so you should save responsibly and take care of your health. Like, I think there's a little bit of disconnect at some point somewhere in there between like living in this whimsical, challenging norms way, and just some point where you're like, no, seriously, you're just going to kill yourself in a car wreck. I mean, if that's okay with you, I guess.
And put other people at risk.
Exactly.
Like, this is the thing. Like, there's just, it's one thing if it's just like do it to herself. My point was earlier about the Reverend and everyone else on the roads. It's like this. No, so because of what I've gone through and what I've learned from it, I'm going to put everyone else at risk and treat it that way. That is the disconnect where I go, like, it's kind of hard to root for this character from that perspective. But then when she, because of the acting being so good, kind of being this completely ha 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 ha, to then kind of showing the real depth to it, I go, that's very powerful. I'm not sure that that's like carte blanche now, like we're going to forgive you for everything else that you've done, but the actor, like that performance is very, very
So
powerful.
who do you think has the higher collateral driving body count, Maude or Vin Diesel in the Fast and the Furious movies?
If she had made 11 of these, probably Maude. But I mean, it's probably good for all of our safety that at the end of this movie, she kills herself, because society would be in danger eternally until Maude was done away with.
Plus, I think it's a little bit like inflation, right? Like if you take 1971 car collateral and you do apply inflation over 50 years, yeah, you'd probably be up there, but like Vin Diesel.
Yeah, it's true. In this movie, they wrecked one car. Precisely one car, whereas in the first Fast and the Furious, what was it, like 79 cars or something they destroyed? So yeah, that's car inflation in movies for you folks. So moving on maybe to Harold. I'm curious what you thought about Bud Cort's performance there.
I think that Bud Cort's performance is like the basis for, we mentioned sort of like Tim Burton earlier. Like Bud Cort makes me, as Harold, makes me wonder if Tim Burton saw this and went like, "Yep, that's sort of who I'm going to base myself on," kind of thing. And like, it's a very like Wednesday Addams performance to me, and that and Wednesday Addams in terms of like the Christina Ricci and the new Netflix series Wednesday versus like the Wednesday Addams from like the television show. So I really like the deadpanning. I really like the theatrical flourishes that he gives his and deliberateness that he gives his fake suicides. I'm good with Bud Cort's performance. I think that it works in this context.
Okay, so I'm going to go about it a little bit different. I think that he's an amazing actor in this, but I hate the stuff in the beginning. I think it is too much. It's too, and it's only in the context of seeing later. The first time you see him smile, genuinely smile, because he's having some reaction that he hasn't had before. He's seeing something new about life and experience. You go, wow, that is incredible. All the previous stuff has helped to lead up to this point because it now makes it notable, like it means something that he's doing a new thing. He's having a new emotion. He's experiencing something new. He's breaking out of that previous thing. But I very much dislike the character that he plays up to that point. I don't think it is fun at all. I don't think it is, but the difference really matters then because you see it. And that's where I think also like the Wednesday character you mentioned is a little bit different, because Wednesday never really goes through that. It's always just the one thing, possibly with an eyebrow, but here there's a drastic difference. And I think that you can really appreciate it more. It just takes so long to get there. And it wasn't always enjoyable for me.
Yeah, I struggled to disconnect the choices between the character as was written, the performance of that character, and the directing that it went into some of those choices. I one of the reviews I read made some comment basically to like a wax figure. And like there's big chunks of the first part of the movie where he barely speaks. So it's a little bit hard to get a read on this guy besides like, all right, he keeps pretending to kill himself in front of his mom. And okay, I don't know what else to make of this guy because he said so little. He's been so like, just like deadpan, barely responding to things. So it's an interesting one for me to try to like carve out the, is this Bud Cort? Is this the character? Is this Hal Ashby in the directing he gave? But yeah, it's a challenging one. Again, I like Maude. So I'm all the way on Team Maude. So maybe here's a good point to take a quick break. And on the other side, we can maybe have a quick conversation about the lady who broke him. We'll be right back. So we're back. There's two big roles in this movie, obviously Harold and Maude, but probably the next biggest role is the role played by Harold's mom, played by Vivian Pickles. I'm curious what both of you think of her in this movie.
I think so. First off, I think just as a name, Vivian Pickles, chef's kiss, great name.
Yep.
I really enjoy her performance. One of, I think, the funniest scenes for me in the whole thing is when she's doing like the setting Harold up for the computer dating, and going through, and it's just like that has me in stitches. Like that to me is such a funny bit, and her deadpanning of things, her frustration with things, and even after the particularly bloody suicide in the bathroom, where she's just like, I can't take it anymore. And she gets that, Harold gets that snap of dopamine, and she has her reaction is like, I think very honest there. But she is so distant and so terrible and so controlling and infantilizing, but also dismissive. And I think that everything that she does helps you go like, oh, I totally get why Harold is.
Yeah, but actually, I wish I could just, maybe we'll do this in the edit, but like go back and take exactly what Chris had said about trying to separate the way the character was written, the actor performance, and the directing. Makes it very hard with someone like that, because I think that there are times when you completely sympathize with her, and there are other times when you go, oh yeah, exactly that. This is why he is who he is. And it is not super consistent. There are times when I think that she is the victim in all this. There's times when I think that he is the victim. And then there are times when it's just plain absurd. So
you say that like it's a bad thing, and that's what makes me wonder. It's like watching Succession, which I haven't seen, but apparently
this is going to be a good analogy,
right? Like,
so when the dinosaurs come into succession, like
but like people tell me that it's a movie about or a TV series about terrible people, and you're sort of end up rooting for this person, but then they do something awful and then you hate them. And then they no longer feel like a victim or someone to root for. You're rooting for this person now, kind of, and then they do something and they're terrible. It's complexity, and that's okay.
Sure. But let me clarify. It's because it's really good writing, really good directing, and really good acting. So that's the difference.
Wait, versus Harold and Maude? Yeah, fair. Shots fired.
Oh,
I'm glad we could straighten that out.
Good, thank you.
There you go.
I mean, here's what I will say. Out of all the characters, I didn't like Harold. I thought Maude was delightful. I didn't find either of them funny, though I found Vivian Pickles at points to be the only one who I thought was funny in the movie. So just some of those moments where it's that like overdone, like haughty accent where she's like, oh, Harold, what have you done? And it's like, okay, yeah, there's just a couple moments where, to your point, answering the questionnaire where it's like, could a woman be president? Well, I don't see why not. Yes. And it's like just going down some of the, I'm like, there's a few moments in there where I appreciated the levity and humor. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about Harold's mom is she is a willing or unwilling participant in a number of scenes, which I think are a great way to get a lens on how Hal Ashby directed this movie. So there is some very interesting framing and editing that goes on. throughout this movie, including in all these scenes where Harold's mom brings these poor unwitting women into the house to have Harold do terrible things and forever traumatize them. And you get these great views of like Harold immolating himself out the window, Harold committing seppuku in the middle of the living room. There's a lot of really interesting framing and visuals that Hal Ashby puts into this movie. It's an interesting way to juxtapose Harold and everything that's going on in Harold's world with everything else that's going on in these bright, colorful situations.
No, I think that you're right. And that is something that happens throughout this film, not just in those moments where, Harold self-immolates, but, like the funeral procession coming out of the church and then like the marching band going by. There always seems to be these little counterpoints, or at least there's a lot of stuff that happens in the backgrounds of scenes that can draw the eye, sometimes play in like, Harold and Maude looking at the tree for the first time, and that they're eventually going to steal, and the cops coming out and like looking at the car and walking around and trying to figure out what's gone on. And so there's always like there's interesting things to look at, and the fact that Hal Ashby comes from editing, that doesn't surprise me. That he's wanting to draw the eye in different ways. And so I think that sort of carries through. But to your point about like Wes Anderson, I feel like, that's another thing that sort of like, carries through in this sort of like lineage from one to the next.
And another way to take Chris's question, which is less charitable, is I feel like there are certain things that the director really wanted to tell. There's certain kind of like scenes, visuals, certain things they want to get across, and then say, how could I do this? And how could I link them together? And it doesn't always make sense, but it would just be like, but that would be so much fun to do. I want to show this thing. I want to have that thing set up, and, torpedoes be damned, right? Like we're just going to go through it, whether it makes sense or not. Whereas I think, I'm a huge Wes Anderson fan. I think he does nothing without a reason. I think everything's pre-calculated. People don't necessarily love it, but it's there for a reason. Here, I think it just felt like things were slapped together. What was the point of the marching band? Who the heck knows? Would a marching band actually do that if they saw a funeral progression? It's very hard for me to see that they would. The whole thing around the mom, like it's like, yes, there were three interested, like someone had this idea about like having these deaths happen, so I'm gonna stage them. Did they make sense? Were they needed? Well, I don't know, but I wanted to show these three different things. Okay, so let's do it. It just seemed a little bit more like I want to do these things, and then how could we possibly include them in the movie? That's the impression I got.
Yeah, I did alternate between, hey, that was really clever, I like the way it's shot, I don't like what's going on, like I found there's also some really beautiful cinematography that went in at various points, just to say, like the scene where they're talking about the flowers and you get this shot of, this whole field of these flowers. You're like, that's very pretty. That's beautiful. And same even with the shot as they pull back on, the cemetery, where you're like, I don't know, there's something touching or moving or beautiful, or I don't know what quite the right word is, but like there's some great scenes. And actually, even to touch on the point that Evan pointed out earlier, when you find out about, when you see the shot of the tattoo on Maude's forearm, like it is a really well crafted edit where other things are going on. You just get this quick snippet, like, you're saying, Evan, where it's like, if you know, you don't need to linger on it. It lingers on it for the exact right amount of time for it to register. And you go like, oh, and then it kind of moves back and you can kind of see this reaction on Harold's face that plays out like, oh shit, like he realizes something too. And like, there's some very, clever editing, framing, directing that goes on there. I mean, like, all credit to Hal Ashby. He wasn't a slouch. He'd already won an Academy Award for editing for In the Heat of the Night. So, he isn't, certainly aware of how to kind of like manage around these things, edit around these things. I think this is the second movie that he directed. But it's an interesting one for me because I actually find the palette and a lot of the way that this movie looks to be pretty enticing. Like you're saying, like there's a certain palette here that's Wes Anderson-ish, and it's bright colors even as this other absurdity is going on around it.
Yeah, and the institutional whites and grays, and the super dark kind of stuffy tones of Harold's house. I think it is all kind of it does play towards visual symbolism. Like it registers in a certain way, and I think that it does it really successfully.
I think it's interesting you mentioned about the editing, because like the entire ending sequence is simultaneously, it's really well done how they keep editing between and shifting between what's going on in the hospital and his drive away out to the coast. Yet it also highlights some real bizarre things about the directing, because it's like they arrive at the hospital and there's no sense of urgency from anyone on the hospital staff. It's just like, oh, let's take our sweet time and get you in here, and they're having a normal conversation. Like there's a weird sense of there's no urgency. There's nothing going on here. He seems upset, but no one else seems upset. So it's like kind of up to that point you go, she's going to be okay, right? Even though she's not going to be okay, because you also see him driving and he's upset in the rain. Like it's just so it's kind of like the editing experiencing versus the experience versus the directing, and how do you kind of like piece it all together?
I don't know. With the people at the hospital, to me, that is still very much of the kind of idea that these institutions are kind of cold and set in their ways, and that is hammered kind of throughout the film. And it also the reaction of the hospital staff still continues to show how much of an outsider Harold is. He's the one who actually cares right now, and now we're actually seeing outpouring of emotion from this person who was, as Chris said earlier, sort of like a wax figure at the beginning. And so to have everyone else around him treating this like something that's like mundane, when this is a guy who has been obsessed with death, does not emote, has done so many fake suicides, is now presented with a real suicide and the specter of real death as it is happening, and not just sort of like being at a funeral or pretending his own stuff. Like that actually heightens the scene to me in that sort of way that they're reactioning.
I found going back to like, there's no real narrative, like, driving this movie. That's where I struggled a little bit with, like, I felt like the Maude suicide, where it's like 80, I get it. Like, she's somebody who is going to live life on her own terms, including how it ends. Totally get it. It's just, I found it weird. Like, I just found, I was like, oh, okay, I guess. It also partly feels like it's like, well, how do we wrap this up? Well, she lives life on her own terms, including how it ends. So she's going to take pills. And I'm like, okay, I don't know. I wasn't 100 for this person who not long ago was, cheerleading life and love every moment and savor everything and enjoy it as long as you can, because you don't know how long you get. I found it was a weird zig. The ending didn't wrap it up kind of in a way that, I mean, I guess most of it wasn't in a way that I could get down with, but the ending also, I don't know. I figured, like, Maude was just going to go out at 80 because she finally actually rolled her car over with the way she drives into a supermarket in the middle of town, wiped out the whole town with her. I don't know. I could have seen it being like that way. And then Harold would have been like, "Ah, Maude, bound to happen eventually. Live your life, girl." But I don't know. I don't know that there was a better way to wrap it up either. So, one of the things though that I think is interesting about the way this movie both ends and begins is holy moly, Cat Stevens songs.
Holy moly!
What did you think of the soundtrack to this movie?
Well, I own the soundtrack on vinyl because I'm that guy, just like I have this movie on DVD. And
you've seen it. Yeah.
TV, and I've seen it. I think it's so interesting to me that like you've got this film that is basically scored almost entirely by like needle drops of the same artist, like, and again, that sort of like, carries through to the kind of Wes Anderson thing. It reminds me of like Life Aquatic or something like that, where you've got, Bowie songs being done in Portuguese, and it's just like, and that's the score kind of thing. But I think it's really sweet. And I think that it adds to the whole kind of like hippie vibe of the whole thing, man.
By the way, I just won on my buzzword bingo for this episode because I was like, Evan will not go this entire episode without saying the word vibe about this movie. Sure enough.
Amazing.
Yeah. So I mean, there's definitely a 70s-ness or whatever to, a Cat Stevens soundtrack, like, or at least almost entirely Cat Stevens soundtrack. But Michael, what about you as our resident music aficionado? What did you think of the music in this movie?
I think there are two separate things. One is the music was very good. The other thing is the music didn't always make sense. And it wasn't until I kind of like read the notes after to say he was originally meant to write all new songs for the entire movie and ran out of time. And was like, I did too. And the two made perfect sense. They're brilliant. But because the director had already used kind of like had a bunch of placeholder songs by Cat Stevens, it was like, they decided to keep them in. And it was like, okay, so those were previously made. The tone is right. The music is beautiful, but the lyrics are sometimes like, I don't see how this fits in with the narrative.
No,
so I'm torn from that perspective. I think that it's amazing that they had the same artist, album, music, like that was brilliant. And for the ones that really like this thing around the where it's like a million things to see, a million ways to be, whatever, like that was brilliant. But there were times when it just didn't work for me because of the lyrics, and I said, I don't see how these things fit together.
Interesting. I kind of felt the same way at points, but I will say, like, probably one of the most enduring things for me after watching this movie is, some of those songs get stuck in your head.
Mm-hmm. Oh boy, do they ever?
Yeah. So walking away from this movie being like, humming tunes like and like my wife was definitely like, "What are you singing?" I'm like, yeah, never mind. So I think one of the questions I would have is, looking at this movie today, I mean, it's 52 years, I guess, after this movie was made. Like, was this a movie ahead of its time? Like, I don't think this is a movie that would get made today. But is this movie that was maybe too far ahead of its time, and maybe that's why it didn't get some of the, recognition and success maybe at the time? Or like, is there something that could have changed there?
I think that this is maybe ahead of its time, but in that same way that like that. And so that's why it's a cult classic. This movie eventually found its people, mm-hmm. right? And those people who, those who like it a lot kind of thing. And it has this outsized footprint pop culturally, like so many of the older films we've watched. And, I think that you could probably like remake this today and it would still feel as relevant. I think that there's still a lot to be gleaned from this film. I don't know who would play Harold and Maude now, but that would be an interesting remake to see with, like, I don't know, like Phoebe Bridgers doing the entire soundtrack or something.
I think, like, yeah, it's sort of, in a way, it's an impossible question to answer, because you need these movies to swing for the fences and be weird and odd and not do well, because otherwise nothing would ever advance. Nothing would ever kind of like move on. If we just did things, what would this have looked like to be more popular at the time? Well, it wouldn't have been as memorable, very likely. It would have been a whole different thing. So like, I can really appreciate what it did and what it was. And it's hard to kind of comment on, well, what could they have done differently? Well, it wouldn't have been the same movie. So I'm glad that it exists. I will say I'm glad we talked about it. I will not have any memories of this and kind of say, oh, I got to go back and do it. But like, it's a necessary movie to advance how we think around movies and some of these stories, and advance the whole genre. Genres.
Which are only for critics. Yeah.
So I think that, you know, you touched on that nicely, Michael. So you won't be returning to this film anytime soon. You know, Chris, same question to you. Like, and I'm guessing I can sort of foresee your answer. Will you be returning to this film anytime soon?
No. I think the thing that I will maybe continue trying to find out about this movie is if there are any extended versions, outtakes, behind the scenes of just how many takes they would have done with Harold trying to explore the wooden carving of a vagina. I think
it's definitely it's absolutely Maude's vagina, right?
Because so I'm wondering if there's like extra reels of that somewhere, and they're like, just keep going, keep going, and like I'm wondering if there's like an extra 15 minutes where they're like, do some other stuff, because I think that would be hilarious to see. But for I think I'm probably. I don't think I'd be coming back to this. I will say that I now get a number of references, which I appreciate, which have drawn from this movie. And, you know, as you've kind of said in previous episodes, like I remember there was a Family Guy episode that made some joke about like when a young person's dating an older person, they're like, what would your grandchildren say? And they do like a zoom in on Stewie giving that rant like the priest gives, that really uncomfortable zoom in where he's like, and the sagging flesh and and you're like, oh God, that's just weird. I find myself really uncomfortable. So I appreciate that part of it. And I think I'll be more aware of that stuff. Because I do think this is one of those things where you do find kind of those connect the dots moments in popular culture to people who love this movie, make reference to this movie and that kind of thing. But I think I'm good. Evan, how often do you watch this movie?
You know, once every 10 years. You know, I do keep coming back to it. I, you know, as I wear my heart on my sleeve with this one, I really love this movie. And to me, it is still funny and poignant, and just a film that I genuinely enjoy.
Well, there you go. I think that's a good place to call it. And that's what we thought about Harold and Maude. We'd love to know what you thought about this movie. You can always find us on Twitter at How Did You Miss This? That's HDYMT_pod. And while you're there, do us a favor. Take a look at some of the other stuff we've made, we're planning on watching, and stuff that's coming up soon. Send us questions, thoughts, ideas. And hey, if there's a movie that you haven't seen that you want us to cover, to let you know whether it's worth it, let us know. In the meantime, do us a favor. Rate, review, subscribe, and do all that kind of clickety-click stuff that you can do on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you happen to be listening. And we're going to be back next week when we're going to be watching About Time and seeing whether this romantic comedy is worth traveling back in time to watch or whether it's something that should stay missed. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you then.